on Saturday and Sunday, the 22nd and 23rd of November, respectively, South Africa's G20 presidency comes to an end. President Ramaphosa hands over symbolically to an empty chair, but also hands over to the United States and President Donald Trump, who will take over the presidency of the G20 in 2026. So South Africa's full year presidency coming to an end. In today's discussion, we're going to look at how South Africa has performed in holding the G20 presidency. We'll look at specifically the elephant in the room. We'll do that first of all, the relationship with the US and what that means for South Africa and maybe for multilateralism more broadly. And then we'll also look a little bit into what South Africa needs to do going forward in terms of its global foreign policy and geopolitical positioning. Joining me to discuss all of that and more, we have Mr. Terence Corrigan, Projects and Publications Manager at the Institute of Race Relations. Terence, thank you very much for making time back here on the CRA YouTube channel. We'll get straight into it. So earlier this week, according to reporting from Bloomberg, the United States formally warned South Africa against pushing for a joint statement at this weekend's G20 summit in Johannesburg that the Trump administration is boycotting. The diplomatic standoff is particularly awkward given it's the first time the continent is hosting a G20 and President Ramaphosa is passing the baton to US President Trump at the end of this year. Terence, what do you make of this latest, I don't know if we should call it a rupture really, because relations have ruptured consistently between South Africa and the US. But on the one hand, the US President Trump, in a way, boycotting this year's G20, especially the summit. But on the other hand, trying to pressure South Africa and saying, don't. South Africa have advanced throughout this year, along the theme of equity, sustainability, other issues around debt relief, climate change, etc., etc. What do you make of this particular statement from the US, and what does it tell you?
Well, I'd just like to comment that I think that the real issue is not the elephant in the room, but the elephant not in the room. But having exhausted that metaphor now, I've said on a number of occasions, I think, including in this channel, that South Africa diplomatically has positioned itself in stark opposition to the US when it comes to the ANC as a party, and I think also to numerous people within South Africa's foreign policy, official foreign policy bureaucracy. There is a barely concealed loathing, and you can go through a sort of list of issues. This, I think, has been 20 years in the making. And remember that it wasn't a Trump appointee who read South Africa the Riot Act in a very undiplomatic fashion. It was the African-American ambassador sent by President Joe Biden, who actually had a history in the anti-apartheid movement or sort of anti-apartheid circles. So, this has been coming for a long time. What I see happening in this particular instance is that President Trump is not your typical head of state. He's a disruptor, the kind of person who's been popping up in across the world for the last 15 years, but he just happens to be sitting at the helm of the world's most powerful country. And the word we hear all the time is transactional. I think that's probably quite accurate. Victor Davis Hanson, the American classicist and sort of conservative commentator, whose work I can really recommend if you want a sort of intelligent defense of President Trump, referred to Trump's instincts as Jacksonian, no better friend, no worse enemy. And I think basically he has taken up the challenge. South Africa wants to position itself as an enemy. Well, it gets treated like that. So this is not just about the G20, but I think that he is very well attuned to the politics of spectacle and the politics of projection. I mean, he was a very flashy businessman, TV personality, etc. And I think he sees South Africa's G20 experience in part through that sort of messaging lens. South Africa gets to occupy a high-profile position, even if it may not lead to much. And what I think he has done is to signal very clearly that South Africa doesn't get to enjoy this. It doesn't get to experience that sense of importance or diplomatic heft or to exercise that sort of influence, because having sort of written itself into America's bad books, and Trump having taken an interest in what's happening in South Africa, albeit I think the very skewed perception in many respects, not all, but many. He is flexing his muscles to say that you proceed down this route at your peril. In a way, it's a sense of disciplining a less powerful state. This hasn't just been about about America not attending. With America not being there, the summit loses a great deal of its reason for being. So the president of Argentina doesn't come. I think it's probably also influenced the decision of the Chinese. This just isn't as big a game as it may have been. So their de facto leader has other things to do with his time. Same thing for the president of Mexico, etc., etc. And I think that that then I think is what is going down here. And I think, as I say, I think there's both some real politics here, but also a strong element of performance and almost ritual humiliation.
And Terence, just on that point, and especially around the sort of transactional nature of President Trump's second administration and his dealings with, allies, adversaries, and everyone in between. Given that the US is hosting the G20 next year, you've already had reports that they might choose not to invite South Africa. That in and of itself, I think, would be, don't assume that President Trump will make that decision now, because you can sort of dangle that over South Africa again in his style around sort of displaying that kind of thing. He could, for example, say, and see how South Africa reacts, float the idea, I'm not going to invite you. What reason are you giving me to bring you to this important the way that I'm trying to reshape the G20? And just on that point, in my sort of interactions with various embassies throughout this year, the reporting, the feedback is that the US is going to focus on the finance track and then on the summit itself. So really whittling down this large agenda, this sort of, in many ways, bloated agenda that has cropped up through the G20 over the years.
I think there's a few moving parts here. The first is that I don't think that America under Trump is particularly interested in multilateralism. Now, I think this is something that any great power is going to look at with very sort of skew eyes. China talks a good game about it, unless you're dealing with its claims in the South China Sea. Interestingly, when China makes those claims, South Africa all of a sudden discovers the virtues of bilateralism. But we can just put that aside. Russia, if it's one of its interests, like in Ukraine, world opinion doesn't mean very much. The French, ditto, etc., etc. This is just this is just the way large, powerful countries get to conduct themselves throughout history. So I think that for the coming few years, at the very least, what we can expect from America is that these multilateral bodies will be assessed as to whether they achieve anything for the United States broadly, and more specifically for President Trump's administration. Now, on the question of their proposed agenda, whittling it down, as you say, there's a part of me that's fairly sympathetic to this. If we remember where the G20 came from, it was an outgrowth of the G7 to acknowledge that the world wasn't like it was in the 1970s, that there were these emerging markets that were very significant economic players, your Indonesias, your Chinas, your South Koreas, and that needed to be accommodated. I mean, China's a massive holder of American debt, for instance, big strategic issue for America. South Africa kind of crawled, sort of crept into the G20 because they sort of needed an African representative, and South Africa had a certain degree of soft power at that point. I think that's mostly been squandered. The G20 itself was intended initially to address things like the global financial crisis, and it seems that it did a passable job on that. I think that as you expand the remit of any organization, it becomes harder and harder to find coherence. So perhaps there is a strong argument to do this. Go back to having something about finance, and deal with things like climate change and security threats elsewhere. In fact, it seems to me that might even be a more sensible option, because one can make the argument it's better that you have the Americans, and particularly the Europeans, meeting with the Russians over something where they might be able to find some sort of agreement, like global financial flows or something like that. Although I suppose you've got a problem, then throwing onto that agenda things like climate change, which the Americans aren't keen on, and whether or not Ukraine should exist as a state, which the Russians aren't particularly keen on, or whether China's ridiculous 9-dash line into the South China Sea, looks anything more like Charles scribblings on a map. So yes, perhaps a more focused thing would be advisable.
Terence, on that point around what comes out of the summit and what, if South Africa tries to play it cleverly, if they want to hand anything over, if anything of use to the US. In your latest column at the Daily Friend, you write, the summit will go ahead, and I quote, perhaps it's not at risk of a thunderous collapse, but there is a risk of the summit turning out to be a damp squib. Optimists might, however, suggest that without the US, a consensus declaration would be easier to come up with, although there are enough issues of contention among the remaining attendees to keep this process a complicated one, end quote. So if you were drafting a declaration or a statement, or, what would you advise that South Africa tried to put forward that could then also be used by the US as well? If now, as you also allude to in your column, there's a serious challenge here for multilateralism more broadly. Like, do these multilateral institutions, are they able to reform and be effective or not? I think to highlight something President Trump mentioned earlier this year in his speech at the United Nations, these multilateral institutions talk a big game, but more often than not, can't deal with real challenges. The African Union, there's a genocide ongoing in Sudan, and the African Union just, make a statement here and there, sort of thing. Sorry, I always have to get a dig in at the EU.
No, absolutely, and it's a completely fair one. Incidentally, the responsibility to protect was apparently conceived of by a Sudanese jurist, Francis Deng. So, and that says a lot. This isn't the first time we've had something like this happening in Sudan. These things have a way of repeating themselves. I remember the NEPAD initiative. We're moving from non-interference to non-indifference, until we really start to face something difficult. Once again, there's a difference between saying that tiny, semi-insignificant Eswatini needs to adopt a more participatory form of governance, as opposed to calling out Zimbabwe, which has many friends in the subcontinent. I'm reminded of Samuel P. Huntington's statement that the price of universal pretensions is hypocrisy in practice. No one, not South Africa, not the US, is immune to that. I think that in an interconnected world, multilateral institutions are essential, but I do think that one has to be realistic about what they can achieve. And I think I would rather have an imperfect system than none at all. I think from the vantage point of South Africa, I think it really comes down to a strategic calculation. What do you hope to achieve out of this? And my sense of it is that one of the very crude choices is: do you want to further antagonize America, or do you want to brandish your global credentials? Now, there is, I think, and probably amongst many people watching this, will say, well, we shouldn't be dictated to by the Americans, and I'm very sympathetic to that. The question, though, is I don't think we fully understand what we're dealing with. I don't think anyone in the world does, because this is talk about elephants in the room. Trump is not a traditional Republican. John McCain, George W. Bush, Mitt Romney would not have behaved like this. In fact, those sort of people are not welcome in the MAGA world, or the MAGAverse. My own sense is perhaps try to encourage cooperation that can then be taken on bilaterally. Perhaps the logical partners would be the Europeans, since they also have a commitment to multilateralism in a way that the Chinese and the Russians don't. I suspect that the Chinese would be in a way just as difficult to deal with as the Americans, because they have a very keen sense of what their interests are as a country and as a civilization, which is a phrase they use. I would probably avoid going for that consensus declaration, because I think not only is it likely to keep the conflict with America burning, although on the other hand, I will say I'm not sure that there's much hope of that going away anytime soon. But I think that there will probably be a number of other countries, American allies, that would also be very reluctant to sign on to this. So I'm not sure. I think South Africa and the committed multilateralists be wasting their time. Sitting here on Thursday, I don't see much hope for that. So perhaps make a statement, sort of chairman's statement, and do not engage in any kind of theatrics. Handing the baton over to an empty chair or anything like that. Rather just let that go, and hope at some point we can sort it out. That being said, we still have no ambassador in Washington. We have essentially indicated that everything that has been gleaned about America's position is sort of off the table, and there'll be no concessions on that. So maybe then the real message of this is just that South Africa is frozen out of America's good graces, maybe for the next 4 years, maybe for the next 8 years, maybe for the next generation. It'd be very, very sad for us, very tragic, very damaging, and I think also not good for the Americans. But I think that is the kind of future we are looking at right now.
I have tried in a few engagements this year to put forward my thesis that some of President Trump's colleagues likely to succeed him, so people like Vice President Vance, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, they're more ideological than he is. They're not, he wants to leave this legacy of having made deals and made peace all around the world. So you can still grab his attention in that way if you figure out how to do these things cleverly. Whereas his colleagues, if South Africa feels things have been harsh under Trump's spotlight, they're in for a different kind of ride under some of his possible successes.
Look, if I could just speculate a little bit on that, I think that Trump has been somewhat caricatured by his focus on Afrikaner refugees, and that's high level performative stuff. I would say, has South Africa, particularly the ANC component, not made every sort of effort to extend support to some of America's most resolute enemies in that part of the world, Venezuela, with which we have virtually no history, and Cuba. Has South Africa not gone on very volubly about the evils of American policy in that part of the world? Let's remember that Marco Rubio is the child of Cuban refugees, and I think there is something South Africa could fruitfully do, is to remember that its own trauma is not the trauma of the rest of the world. So yes, when South Africa gushes about the wonders of Fidel Castro, well, there are many many American citizens, often with brownish complexion, speaking with Spanish accents, for whom that is deeply, deeply, deeply offensive. When South Africa talks about the wonders that bind us to Russia, and how Vladimir Putin is a good friend, and then tries to land a plane load full of arms in Warsaw Airport, it mustn't expect a sympathetic reception when you consider that Poland's great trauma was being dismembered by the Germans on the one hand and the Russians on the other, and right now they're friends with the Germans but not with the Russians, etc., etc., etc. Likewise, I'm not sure just what sort of sympathy it would find among, in some countries that border the South China Sea, the Philippines, Vietnam, etc. For whom the looming Chinese-centered world order is not something that they look forward to, because they have millennia of conflict. And right now are finding their own shipping being harassed in that part of the world. And South Africa says, well, they must resolve this bilaterally. So South Africa might fruitfully show a bit of introspection on some of these things. Whether that will make any difference to our relationship with America, I'm not sure. And I think, unfortunately, it's probably somewhat doubtful. And maybe a transactional relationship is the only thing we can hope for. And perhaps that is possible.
Yeah, but if you're the world's moral superpower, you don't have to introspect. You don't have to ask such searching questions of yourself. Terence, a final question. Aside from the G20, and that's the headlines, spotlight, all of that is there. We've had street lights fixed. We've had lines repainted. Those of us who live in Johannesburg on certain routes, so the some upgrades have happened. What would you want to see from the South African government side to make the country more appealing from an investment, from a growth, from a jobs creation point of view, aside from the nice headlines and things? I'm sure the President Ramaphosa will say afterwards, the EU is committing to invest however many billions in renewable energy. There's always these compacts and these grand promises, but we don't see, real investment. So what can, I guess the best case scenario, the sort of energy from the G20 that South Africa could use.
An event like this can be a useful showcasing opportunity, but I think that there are a couple of huge fallacies in the way the South African state approaches investment. It seems to imagine that if you can show off a good side to a foreign government, you'll get investment. It's not governments generally that invest; it is companies. Secondly, the idea that you can have all of these growth-killing measures built into your business environment, but if you can explain them, everything will be peachy. Now, a few days ago, actually, I was listening to a foreign businessman say, "Well, the people in his home country don't understand BEE, but they can be brought around to it if you explain the need for redress and restitution." My comment to that is he might be talking about the one company with deep pockets that has a particular interest in this part of the world and is willing to make that sacrifice. Not the 50 companies that just look and say 30% of my equity and a crippling fine for not meeting a racial target in my workforce. No, I'm not going there. I'll go to Romania. I'll go to to Hungary. I'll go to Azerbaijan. South Africa is just not that big of a game in town. So in that sense, fixing up potholes and everything so that diplomats can go home and say what a beautiful city Joburg is, because I spent an evening in Melrose Arch and it's amazing. That is not a compelling investment case. And this is not about convincing companies, one at a time that you should come and invest here. It's about people looking and saying, "Wow, this is a place that markets itself." So when those potholes are fixed as a matter of course, when the streetlights go on, and when you're not likely to be subjected to an 8-hour load reduction because you're dealing with infrastructure dating from the 1960s. Then that case will start to make itself, and at that point, government can actually contribute by marketing itself. But anybody who's ever tried to sell anything knows that a bad and unappealing product is not likely to find a buyer.
Yeah, sort of on its own merits. You shouldn't have to need to dress it up and all that kind of thing. And I think with this new US administration, with things shifting globally, I mean, investors and markets, they are pulling back a bit, even from places like the US. They're looking for investment. But if you don't make it easy, if you don't make the sort of the structures and the basics appealing, we're not going to attract that investment, regardless of those shifting, I think, trade and investment flows.
Well, look, the big number that we talk about is 15%. 15% of gross fixed capital formation is 15% of GDP. The National Development Plan wanted 30% for a sustained period. I don't think we've ever actually achieved that. Certainly not post 1994. And a lot of that investment that we do get is plant that is wearing out and is essentially being replaced. And also over the last couple of years, compensating for the state. South Africa was turned into a bring your own infrastructure economy. That is simply not a compelling case. Perhaps, if South Africa was Nigeria and there were vast untapped resources and potentials, you'd be willing to go in there to be first on the ground. But we've got a funny situation: a fairly developed market with the subpar factors to maintain it. And as I say, if you're a European or a Japanese or an American investor, you can look at a place like Croatia or a place like Romania, or a place like Thailand. There is not a great deal that recommends South Africa.
Very much so. As I hear a few of our very few remaining grippins fly overhead, and we're going to wrap up there. At least we have something still to display for the summit. But Terence, thank you very much for your time, your analysis, your insight. Let's see what exactly comes out of the summit, if South Africa uses any of it cleverly or not, if we continue to lean into the moral superpower status. But in any case, lots, I'm sure, for us to unpack afterwards. As also, Terence, we will have you back very soon after the summit. To all of you, thank you very much for watching. If you haven't yet, please like this video. We also invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.